Between 2006 and 2010, one of the world's largest banks laundered $881 million for Mexican and Colombian drug cartels. They processed money for organizations that murdered thousands, trafficked drugs that killed tens of thousands more, and destabilized entire countries. The bank was HSBC, Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, one of the most respected financial institutions on earth. And they didn't accidentally facilitate cartel money. They deliberately ignored warnings, bypassed safeguards, and built systems specifically designed to move dirty money. When they were caught, nobody went to jail. The bank paid a $1.9 billion fine, 5 weeks of profit, and called it a lesson learned. Meanwhile, people who sold small amounts of drugs got decades in prison. This is the story of how a British bank became the cartel's favourite laundromat, and how they got away with it. HSBC was founded in 1865 in Hong Kong to finance trade between China and Europe, but not just any trade, opium trade. British merchants were importing opium into China, creating millions of addicts, and HSBC financed the operations. From day one, HSBC's business model involved drugs. The opium trade was legal at the time, but morally, HSBC was financing addiction and death for profit. It's a pattern that would repeat 150 years later. By the 2000s, HSBC had grown into one of the largest banks in the world, operating in 80+ countries with assets exceeding $2 trillion. They marketed themselves as the world's local bank, a trusted, respectable institution. But behind the marketing, HSBC had a problem. Their anti-money laundering controls were deliberately inadequate, and drug cartels noticed. Mexico in the 2000s was a war zone. Drug cartels, Sinaloa, Los Zetas, Gulf Cartel, were fighting brutal turf wars. Tens of thousands died. Beheadings, massacres, mass graves. The violence was incomprehensible, and behind every murder was money, drug money. Billions of dollars in cash that needed to be laundered, cleaned, legitimized, and moved into the global financial system. The cartels had a problem. How do you launder billions in cash? You need banks. And most banks, facing strict US regulations after 9/11, had enhanced their anti-money laundering systems. Most banks were too risky, but HSBC Mexico was different. HSBC Mexico had deliberately weak controls. They didn't ask questions. They didn't verify sources. They processed suspicious transactions without reporting them. The cartels found their bank. Here's how it worked. Cartels would deposit millions in cash at HSBC Mexico branches. The amounts were absurd. Billions of dollars in small bills, often smelling of drugs, clearly derived from illegal activity. A normal bank would flag these deposits immediately. They'd file suspicious activity reports, SARs, with authorities. They'd investigate the source. HSBC Mexico didn't. They accepted the cash, deposited it into accounts, and transferred it to HSBC accounts in the United States and Europe. Clean money, legitimized through banking. Between 2006 and 2010, HSBC Mexico moved at least $881 million in drug money. But investigators believe the real number is much higher, possibly $7 billion. And HSBC headquarters in London knew. They received warnings. Compliance officers raised red flags. US regulators sent alerts. HSBC leadership ignored all of them. The evidence of HSBC's complicity is overwhelming. In 2008, HSBC's head of compliance warned that Mexican operations posed significant money laundering risks. Leadership did nothing. In 2010, a US Senate investigation found that HSBC Mexico was shipping $7 billion in physical cash to the US, more than any other Mexican bank. The amount was so large it could only be drug money. HSBC claimed they didn't know. HSBC's own compliance staff identified 17,000 plus alerts of suspicious activity in Mexico. Senior management blocked investigations and prevented filings with authorities. When US regulators demanded HSBC improve controls, the bank created the appearance of compliance while maintaining systems that allowed laundering to continue. This wasn't negligence, this was deliberate. HSBC wanted the cartel money because it was profitable, and they were willing to facilitate murder to get it. The Sinaloa cartel, run by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, was HSBC's biggest client. Sinaloa was responsible for trafficking tons of cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine into the United States. They murdered competitors, witnesses, journalists, and police officers. El Chapo became one of the richest criminals in history, worth an estimated $1 billion, and much of that money flowed through HSBC accounts. Think about that. While El Chapo was ordering executions, HSBC was processing his money. While cartel hitmen were dissolving bodies in acid, HSBC bankers were transferring funds. The bank was a full partner in the operation. It wasn't just drug cartels. HSBC also facilitated transactions for organizations linked to terrorism. They processed $290 million for Iranian entities under US sanctions. They moved money for organizations connected to Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah. They violated sanctions against North Korea, Sudan, and Libya. HSBC had built a bank that criminals, cartels, and terrorists could use to move money globally. And they did it deliberately, because criminal money is still money, and HSBC wanted the fees. In 2012, a US Senate investigation exposed everything. The report was damning. 334 pages of evidence showing HSBC knowingly laundered cartel money, violated sanctions, and ignored warnings. The findings were undeniable. $881 million in confirmed drug cartel money laundered. Likely $7 billion total. 17,000 compliance alerts ignored. Deliberate bypassing of anti-money laundering controls. Senior executives aware and complicit. The Senate wanted prosecutions. The Department of Justice prepared criminal charges. HSBC executives could face prison. The bank could lose its US banking license, effectively a death sentence for a global bank. And then something extraordinary happened. Nothing. In December 2012, the Department of Justice announced the settlement. HSBC would pay $1.9 billion in fines. They'd agree to improved compliance. They'd accept and monitor, but no criminal charges. No executives prosecuted. No one went to jail. The reason? HSBC was too big to jail. Prosecutors feared that criminal charges would destabilize the global financial system. HSBC was so large, so interconnected, that prosecuting them might trigger economic catastrophe. So the bank that laundered $881 million for cartels that murdered thousands paid a fine equal to 5 weeks of profit, and everyone walked free. Let's put this in perspective. HSBC laundered $881 million for drug cartels. Fine, $1.9 billion. No jail time. A street-level drug dealer selling $1,000 of drugs? 10 to 20 years in prison. A person caught with a small amount of drugs? Mandatory minimum sentences. Criminal record, life destroyed. But HSBC executives who facilitated cartel operations worth hundreds of millions? Nothing. Not a single day in prison. The message was clear. If you're poor and sell drugs, you go to prison. If you're a bank and launder cartel money that funds thousands of murders, you pay a fine and continue operating. HSBC claimed they'd learned their lesson. They improved compliance. They fired some executives. They promised it would never happen again. But here's the reality. HSBC made billions from cartel money. They paid $1.9 billion in fines. They still came out ahead. And the precedent was set. Banks can facilitate organized crime, and the worst consequence is a fine. No criminal liability, no jail time, just cost of doing business. Since then, multiple banks have been caught in similar scandals. Standard Chartered, JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, each paid fines. None faced criminal prosecution. Between 2006 and 2010, HSBC laundered $881 million for Mexican and Colombian drug cartels. They ignored 17,000 compliance warnings. They bypassed anti-money laundering systems. They facilitated organizations that murdered tens of thousands of people. When caught, they paid $1.9 billion, 5 weeks of profit, and nobody went to jail. The Department of Justice called them too big to jail. Meanwhile, people who sold small amounts of drugs got decades in prison. The inequality is staggering. HSBC was founded financing the opium trade. 150 years later, they were still profiting from drugs. Only now, instead of creating addicts, they were enabling cartels that murdered thousands. This is modern banking, where facilitating mass murder is a compliance issue, not a crime. Where $881 million in cartel money earns a fine, not prison time. Where banks are above the law because prosecuting them might hurt the economy. HSBC laundered drug money. They knew, they didn't care, and they got away with it. Welcome to Too Big to Jail, where banks commit crimes, pay fines, and keep operating. While you'd go to prison for doing 1% of what they did. That's justice in the modern financial system.